Hey guys, picture this. It's the dead cold January of 1348. The wind rattles your shutters like a cat angry at its own tail. And you're shivering in a hut that smells of damp straw, sweat, and one questionable goat that wandered in last night. If you think your roommate's socks are a horror show, you're in for a treat. So before we plunge into how medieval peasants cobbled together shelters that could survive a blizzard, smash that like button if you love a good old-fashioned survival story. And drop a comment below with your most ridiculous winter DIY disaster. Now dim the lights. Grab a mug of something that isn't water from a frozen well and get cozy because you're about to step into a cold-soaked cottage where the walls are literally made of mud mixed with horse manure, and the roof is a patchwork of thatch that squeaks louder than a 90s VHS tape rewinding. You'll feel the bite of icy drafts slipping through every crack. Hear the creak of beams straining under the weight of snow like an elderly grocer's sigh. And smell the earthy perfume of peat fire smoke that clings to your clothes like a stubborn ex, while we'll reveal the genius of wattle and daub, the ruthless pragmatism of just pile more straw, and the surprisingly modern hack of insulating with sheep's wool. You'll also see how this medieval IKEA-style DIY compares to today's. Just buy a pre-furnished cabin on Airbnb. Have you ever tried to stay warm with nothing but a blanket and a hot water bottle? How did that end? Stick around, because the next few minutes will heat up your brain faster than a hearth fire on a night when even the moon looks like it's shivering. The last amber leaves of autumn slipped from the oaks surrounding Eldenbrook, casting soft shadows on the thatched roofs that had sheltered generations. Eric, his hands still stained from the day's thrashing, watched the wind curl around the half-timbered walls, feeling the first bite of chill on his cheek. Myra, balancing a basket of drying herbs, heard the distant murmurs of the river turning to ice, a low, steady sigh against the stone. Joran, the village carpenter, ran his calloused fingers over the rough pine beams, recalling a winter many years past when the hearth had been their only defense. Together, they sensed that this season would press harder than any before. A quiet forewarning that the coming frost would test more than their stamina. By the time the first frost painted the field silver, the council assembled in the low stone hall, the air thick with the scent of damp wood and fear, veiled in polite concern. Joran spoke of cracks in the roof joints, each creak echoing like a warning drumbeat against the howling wind beyond the thatch. Eric's breath clouded as he described shutters that would not close fully, letting the cold seep like a thief through the cracks. Myra, clutching a trembling shawl, whispered that the stored grain was already shivering under the draft, its husks trembling with each gust. The decision was unanimous, yet solemn. The village would pool labor and timber to raise sturdier shelters before the snow settled. A communal effort born of necessity rather than choice. The irony of the task lay in the very tools they wielded. Old axes, worn smooth by generations, now seemed too gentle for the ambitious frames they were to raise. Joran, with a grin that barely lifted his eyebrows, suggested reinforcing walls with wattle and daub, a technique whispered about in distant market towns, but rarely tried here. Eric, who had never lifted more than a sack of grain, found himself balancing a beam larger than his own shoulders, the wood slick with frost. Myra, whose skill lay in weaving baskets, now helped knot thick ropes, each not a small testament to adaptation. As the villagers worked side by side, the clatter of hammers and the rustle of pine shavings blended into a strangely comforting rhythm, as if the very act of building soothed the impending cold. When dusk settled, the newly erected shelters glowed amber from the firelight that flickered through newly sealed windows, casting gentle shadows on the walls. The scent of burning oak mingled with the earthy aroma of fresh mud, a warm blanket over the chill that still lingered in the air. Joran leaned against a newly nailed post, feeling the steady pulse of the structure beneath his palm, a quiet assurance that this night would hold steady. Eric shared a bowl of stew with Myra, the steam rising like soft whispers, while children curled near the hearth, their eyes half closed to the comforting crackle. In that hush, the village breathed as one. The night wind outside reduced to a distant murmur, and the sense of collective achievement settled like a soft blanket over all. When spring finally coaxed the snow away, the villagers walked through the cleared fields, each step echoing on the sturdy floors they had built together. The shelters stood firm, their walls bearing the subtle scars of winter, a few frost-etched lines, a weathered beam, but they held steadfast, a reminder of the quiet resolve that had saved them. Eric paused at the doorway, fingers tracing the grain of the wood, feeling the lingering chill of memory fade under the warm sun. Myra, now older, watched the children play, their laughter a gentle counterpoint to the wind that once threatened to tear them apart. In the hush of the new season, Eldenbrook understood that survival was less about grand gestures and more about the patient, ordinary acts that stitched the community together. A lesson whispered by the stones and the wind alike, as the first frost painted the thatch of the village roofs a pale gray. The men and women of the hamlet gathered at the edge of the forest, their breath forming thin clouds in the cold morning air. Axes and sickles rested in their hands, the wood smoke from the hearth still warm against their sleeves. They moved slowly among the saplings, listening to the soft crack of twigs underfoot, while the sunrise filtered through lingering mist, stripping bark for wattle and gathering rushes for thatch became a rhythm as steady as the low murmur of the river beyond the fields. The work felt ordinary, yet each deliberate motion stitched a quiet promise of shelter against the approaching cold. By midday the forest grew thinner, the familiar oak groves showing patches of wilted leaves that whispered of a blight unseen before. The villagers exchanged uneasy glances, their hands slowing as the bark grew brittle, and the saplings less willing to bow. A sudden rustle from the thicket reminded them of wolves whose eyes gleamed like distant lanterns, making the wind carry a low, warning howl. The scarcity of fresh wood pressed against their resolve, each fallen branch seeming to cost more than its weight. Still, they persisted, stacking what they could into piles that shivered under the cold. The sound of their clumsy hammer strikes echoing like a muted drum. The atmosphere hovered between urgency and resignation, the forest itself feeling both generous and reluctant. In an ironic twist, the blighted oaks yielded a hollowed core of dry heartwood that cracked easily, providing a surprising source of fuel for the communal fire. A handful of children, unnoticed by the weary adults, tripped over a patch of wild rushes that had escaped the wolves' notice. Their bright green stalks still supple enough for thatch. The villagers laughed softly, the sound muffled by the snow that began to feather the ground. Their chuckles a subtle reminder that nature often hides gifts within its hardships. Yet the wolves, now cautious, kept to the shadows, their presence reduced to a faint scent that drifted away with the wind. The irony settled like a warm ember, reminding the laborers that even dwindling resources could be reshaped into comfort with a little patience. As twilight deepened, the half-built shelters stood in a row, their wattle walls trembling gently in the evening breeze. Hands covered in dirt and pine sap arranged rushes atop the frames, each bundle pressed down with deliberate care, the sound of straw rustling like a whispered lullaby. The hearths, though still modest, glowed amber through the gaps, casting soft shadows on faces that were both tired and content. Women tucked woolen blankets around shoulders, feeling the chill recede where the fire's heat met the stone floor. The wolves, now distant, were forgotten, as the villagers shared a simple broth, the steam rising in quiet curls that merged with the cold night air. In that steady cadence of building and resting, the village found a calm rhythm that steadied the heart of winter itself. When the snow finally melted and the first green shoots pierced the thawed earth, the shelters stood firm, their modest frames testifying to the season's trials. The villagers walked their new thresholds with a measured pride, the rough texture of the walls still cool beneath their fingertips. Memories of the blight and the wolf's distant howl lingered like a faint echo reminding them of the fragile balance between need and abundance. They gathered once more by the communal fire, sharing stories that were less about triumph and more about the quiet endurance that had kept them warm. In the soft amber light, the village recognized that survival was less a dramatic battle and more a series of patient, ordinary gestures that stitched together the fabric of their shared winter. When the first frost settled over Eldenbrook, the fields turned to muted gray, and the wind whispered through the bare thatch of each hut. The villagers, each wrapped in woolen cloaks, gathered in the central clearing, where the old oak still held the memory of summer's harvest. Joran, the carpenter, laid a bundle of split oak on the ground, its rough bark catching the pale light. Myra stood beside him, her hands already stained with the ochre of spun flax, while children hovered like quiet witnesses. The cold was a promise, and the decision to raise a new shelter became a silent pact among them. As night fell, the air grew sharper, biting the skin of those who lifted stones and hefted timber. The sound of hammers striking fresh joints echoed against the frosted hillside, a rhythm that both comforted and warned of the work ahead. Joran demonstrated the mortise and tenon joint, his fingers dusted with sawdust, while a few villagers fumbled with the unfamiliar angles. Myra organized the women to spin extra thatch, their looms humming in the dim glow of oil lamps, each strand a thin barrier against the chill. The tension lay not in fear of the cold, but in the fragile coordination of many hands trying to shape something sturdy enough to hold it back. There was a quiet irony in watching the villagers, accustomed to sheltering themselves beneath leaky roofs, now laboring to seal every gap with clay and straw. Eric, who rarely lifted more than a sack of grain, found himself guiding a night watch, his lantern casting long shadows that danced over half-built walls. The timber frames, still raw, creaked when the wind pressed against them, as if the wood itself questioned the haste of its makers. Women laughed softly as a bundle of thatch slipped from a basket, landing on a neighbor's boots and drawing a brief, amused murmur from the crowd. The absurdity of constructing safety, while the cold already seeped through the old doors, softened the urgency into something almost ceremonial. When the moon rose, a gentle amber hue settled over the half-finished shelter, and the villagers fell into a steady pattern like a well-rehearsed waltz. Eric's night watch moved slowly along the perimeter, his breath visible in thin clouds, while the soft thud of mallets blended with the distant hoot of an owl. The communal effort became a quiet hymn. Hands passed bundles of clay, fingers brushed damp earth, and the scent of wet soil rose like a promise. Myra handed a freshly spun rope to a young man, who tied it around a timber beam with a practiced knot, his eyes reflecting the flickering light. The walls rose inch by inch, the wattle mesh tightening, sealing the space that would soon keep out the wind. In the pause between strikes, a feeling of solidarity settled over the clearing, as warm as the ember that glowed in the center. By sunrise, the shelter stood solid, its thatched roof a soft, amber hill against the pale sky, and the villagers stepped back to admire their joint labor. The interior filled with a faint, comforting heat, the clay walls retaining the faint glow of the morning fire that Eric tended. Joran leaned against a newly erected beam, his hands still rough, and felt the quiet pride of a craft that had turned necessity into shelter. Myra brushed a strand of dried thatch from her cheek, smiling at the gentle rustle of wind, now muted by the sealed walls. The cold outside lingered, but its bite was softened by the collective breath of those who built, a reminder that even in hardship, human hands can shape safety. As the day unfolded, the village settled into a slow rhythm, the new shelter becoming a quiet backdrop to meals, stories, and the steady ticking of time. The season had already loosened the last green from the fields, and the peasants gathered twine and timber as the evenings grew shorter. Under a bruised sky they wove wattle frames, their hands steady despite the bite of the early frost. Children helped by passing smooth stones for foundations, while the elders measured the length of each pole with a worn wooden ruler. The scent of fresh-cut oak mixed with the smoke of a dying fire, marking the transition from harvest to shelter. By nightfall, the rows of half-finished huts glowed faintly, each one a promise against the coming white wind. When the first gusts arrived, the sky turned a feral white that seemed to swallow the horizon. The wind howled like a living beast, rattling the loose shingles and tugging at the fresh wattle with impatient fingers. Some of the hastily raised huts, built only with mud and thatch, shuddered and collapsed under the pressure, sending splinters onto the frozen earth. Cries rose from the thatch poor structures as families scrambled to gather stray belongings before the storm stole them. Yet the wattle-reinforced homes stood, their interlaced reeds flexing but not breaking, offering a thin, stubborn silhouette against the fury. It was amusing, in a quiet way, to watch the modestly built wattle walls endure while the more elaborate, yet less practical, thatch roofs fell like fallen leaves. The villagers, accustomed to the slow rhythm of sowing and reaping, now found themselves spectators to a sudden contest of materials. The very simplicity of the reeds, twisted together by calloused fingers, proved more resilient than the ornate carvings that had been added for pride. Laughter, subdued and breath heavy, slipped through the gaps of the storm as someone remarked that the humble design had outwitted ambition. The ironic comfort lay in the fact that the hearths, tucked into the sturdy huts, continued to glow undisturbed, casting amber light on faces streaked with snow. As the wind exhausted itself, a hush settled over the village, broken only by the soft crackle of firewood in the central hearths. Warmth radiated outward, coaxing frost-bitten fingers to rest on chipped stone benches. Villagers drew close, sharing loaves of rye and mugs of thin ale, their voices low and rhythmic like the fading echo of the storm. The smoke curled lazily toward the now still sky, painting faint ribbons against the pale dusk. In that shared silence, the sturdiness of the shelters felt less like a construction and more like an unspoken pact, each beam a quiet affirmation of collective survival. When dawn finally brushed the horizon with a soft amber, the snow lay undisturbed, a blanket over the remnants of the night's chaos. The surviving huts bore the faint impression of the wind's passage, their walls slightly bowed, but intact, a testament to careful craftsmanship. Children slipped barefoot across the icy ground, their laughter gentle, while elderly hands inspected the wattle, noting the subtle flecks that had saved them. The experience lingered like the lingering heat of the hearth, reminding each person that the strongest defenses are often the simplest, forged not by grandeur, but by shared purpose. With quiet steps, they began repairs, aware that the next winter would arrive, and that their calm resolve would again be the shelter against the white wind. At first light, the village lay under a thin veil of frost, the air tasting of iron and pine. Men and women gathered beside the communal fire, their hands already numb, yet their eyes bright with purpose. They unfolded bundles of split oak and hewn beams, each piece laid out like a quiet promise against the looming cold. The elder, his voice soft as the wind, described the shape of the new shelters, pointing to the ground where the snow would soon melt. In the hush of dawn, they began to mark the corners, feeling the rough grain of wood beneath calloused fingers, aware that the day ahead would test every shared breath. The sky darkened quickly, and a fierce gust tore across the open fields, rattling the thatch of the few pre-existing huts. With every hammer strike, the wind seemed to answer, sending shivers through the timber and through the workers themselves. Sweat mixed with the cold, turning their cloths into a damp, clinging skin, while the sound of splintering wood echoed like distant drums. Yet the peasants pressed on, hauling heavier logs with synchronized steps, their breath forming fleeting clouds that vanished into the storm. The tension rose as the night crept nearer, and each newly set post felt like a fragile barrier against an unforgiving white tide. In the midst of frantic shoveling, a barrel of rye fell, spilling golden grains onto the icy ground, creating a brief, soft rustle that amused a few tired faces. A young apprentice, trying to steady a roof beam, slipped on the slick snow and landed with a muted thud, only to emerge laughing as the beam settled perfectly into place. The community exchanged weary smiles, the absurdity of their mishaps cutting through the cold severity like a thin blade of humor. Even as the wind howled, the rhythm of their work retained a gentle cadence, each misplaced stone or splintered board becoming part of an unspoken joke. The irony lay in how the harshest elements coaxed a quiet camaraderie that the gentle seasons never demanded. When the storm finally released its grip, the sunrise painted the newly erected shelters in a soft amber glow, their steep roofs holding back the last breath of snow. Inside, fire pits crackled, sending warm ribbons of orange light that brushed the rough walls, while the scent of burning oak mingled with the faint aroma of boiled beans. The villagers settled on straw-filled benches, feeling the comforting weight of the timber against their backs as they shared modest meals. Silence settled like a gentle blanket, punctuated only by the occasional pop of embers and the soft rustle of woolen cloaks. In that calm, the collective effort seemed to translate into a living warmth that radiated beyond the physical structure, reassuring each heart that the night's terror had been turned into shelter. As the dusk deepened, the village elder traced a simple inscription on the central beam, a stylized wind swirling around the words, "White Wind," their faces half shadowed, the letters slowly carving memory into wood. The act felt like a quiet pact, a reminder that unity and craft could outlast any winter spite, and that future hands would feel the same grain when they leaned against the wall. Children, eyes half closed, listened to the soft murmur of the fire, while the adults rested, the glow reflecting off their contented faces. The story settled into the very timbers, a modest monument to perseverance that would echo through the seasons without fanfare. In that lingering hush, the peasants understood that their modest shelters were not merely protection from cold, but a testament to the patient art of living together. When the first flakes settled on the thatched roofs of Eldermore, a thin silver light filtered through the low clouds, and the great communal longhouse exhaled a steady plume of pine smoke. The blacksmith, his hands still stained with soot, entered with a rusted hammer tucked under his arm, followed by the herbalist carrying a bundle of dried lavender that whispered faintly in the cold air. A young shepherd, cheeks reddened by the wind, slipped in behind the goat skin cloak he wore, while the village elder shuffled forward, his cane tapping a measured rhythm on the packed earth. Inside, the longhouse's low beams creaked slightly, echoing the soft thud of a weathered door closing against the winter gusts. The hearth, already glowing amber, waited as the first stories of the season gathered like embers around it. The blacksmith spoke first, his voice low but edged with concern, as he described the thinness of the iron ore supplies and the risk of frozen tools that could blunt their work. The herbalist answered in a hushed tone, noting that the frost would drive the wild thyme deeper into the forest, making the usual foraging routes treacherous and the medicinal roots harder to find. The shepherd added a quiet sigh, mentioning that the flock would need extra grain. Yet the fields were still buried beneath ice, and the cold could numb even the strongest lambs. The elder, eyes hidden by the shadow of his woolen hood, listened, and then reminded them of the ancient pact, the quiet promise that each household would leave a loaf of rye on the hearth for the next night's travelers. A thin thread of tension wove through their words, a reminder that survival rested on a balance as delicate as the frosted glass panes that framed the longhouse's windows. A small, almost imperceptible chuckle rose from the blacksmith as he lifted a cold spoon to stir the coals, noting how the fire seemed to protest the very act of being fed. Sputtering like a sleepy cat, the herbalist, arranging sprigs of rosemary on a wooden board, remarked that the same herbs used to ward off illness were now being offered to the fire as a gesture of respect. A quiet irony the village had embraced for generations. The shepherd, while untying his rope, observed that the lambs outside now pressed their noses against the fence, as if seeking the warmth they could never reach, mirroring the villagers' own desire for comfort. The elder, his beard brushing the bench, smiled faintly, his voice softened to a whisper, noting how the communal longhouse itself had become a living ledger, each breath of smoke recording the day's tiny absurdities. Their shared laughter was muted, like the soft fall of snow on a distant roof, yet it carried a gentle acknowledgement of the absurd balance between labor and leisure. Soon the conversation settled into a steady rhythm, much like the crackle of the hearth that painted amber shadows on the rough-hewn walls. The blacksmith handed a warm cup of barley broth to the herbalist, whose fingers traced the steam as if reading a quiet script only the eyes could see. The shepherd rested his boots by the fire, allowing the heat to seep through the leather, and the elder placed a smooth stone he had found near the frozen stream onto the communal table, a simple token of the day's quiet endurance. Outside, the wind whispered against the longhouse's eaves, but inside, the room breathed a soft sigh of contentment, each participant moving with deliberate slowness, As if savoring the mere act of being present, the atmosphere grew thick with the scent of smoked meat and pine resin, a comforting blanket that wrapped the villagers in a shared stillness, the kind that lingers long after the fire has dimmed. When the night deepened and the snow fell in steady, muffled sheets, the elder rose slowly, his silhouette merging with the dim glow of the dying embers. He glanced at each face, still, slightly amused, a hint of fatigue in their eyes, and felt the weight of countless winters folded into this single evening, each one a quiet lesson about resilience hidden in routine. The blacksmith's hammer rested against the wall, the herbalist's satchel lay open, and the shepherd's cloak draped over a wooden stool. All signs of work paused, awaiting the dawn. In that lingering pause, the longhouse seemed to hold its breath, a living archive of ordinary moments that together formed the heart of Eldermore's survival. With a soft sigh, the elder whispered a final thought to the empty air, a reminder that the true strength of a village lies not in grand gestures, but in the patient, unhurried gathering around a hearth that never truly burns out. The first snow of the season settled on the thatch of Eldermore's longhouse, a low, timbered hall that had sheltered generations through harsher winters. Inside, the fire crackled against the stone hearth, sending thin ribbons of amber light across the worn benches, where women mended wool and men repaired the plowshares stored against the wall. Outside, the wind whispered through the bare branches, rattling the shutters in a rhythm that matched the slow breathing of the sleeping children. Each breath of the villagers seemed to linger a moment longer, as if the cold itself were a patient listener. The longhouse, a communal artery, held the scent of peat smoke and the quiet murmur of daily tasks, grounding the village in a shared, unhurried pace. As the days grew darker, the stockpiled grain in the rear alcove began to show the first signs of depletion. The wooden barrels echoing a gentle clink when the caretakers lifted their lids. Word arrived that the neighboring clan of Brackenfield, long reluctant allies, had been driven to hunger by a later blizzard, and now eyed Eldermore's stores with a cautious hunger. The elders gathered around the fire, their faces barely illuminated, and spoke in low tones about the threat of a raid, the sound of their voices barely rising above the howl of the wind. Tension settled like frost on the windows, each creak of the timber beams seeming to count the minutes until a possible confrontation. Yet the villagers, accustomed to the slow march of seasons, held their tools steady, the quiet steadiness of their hands betraying the simmering unease beneath the surface. When the storm peaked, a muffled thud resonated against the longhouse wall as a group from Brackenfield slipped through the drifts, not with swords, but with empty sacks and shivering shoulders. Their leader, a gaunt figure whose face remained hidden in the shadow of his cloak, raised a hand in a gesture that was half apology, half plea, as the wind stripped away the last of his winter beard. The irony lay in the shared misery. Both houses hunched beneath the same relentless white, their breath forming mirrors on the glass. A hesitant pause followed. Then the eldest of Eldermore offered a bowl of stew, the steam rising like a temporary fog of fellowship in the cramped hall. Laughter, thin and surprised, slipped through the wooden beams, the sound dissolving the earlier sharp edge of fear as the strangers took modest seats on the benches. Night settled deeper, the storm waning to a soft whisper, and the longhouse settled into a rhythm of communal quiet. Hands that had once tightened around makeshift weapons now passed wooden spoons, the clink of metal against ceramic, a gentle metronome to the crackling fire. Outside, the snow fell in slow, steady sheets, muffling the world into a muted canvas of white and the faint glow of distant torches. Conversation drifted from the day's tension to stories of past winters, each tale narrated with a sleepy cadence that matched the sway of the flames. In that shared stillness, the longhouse seemed to breathe as one organism, its timbers sighing with the weight of both fear and relief. The air scented with smoked meat and a hint of honeyed tea. When dawn finally brushed the horizon with a pale amber, the storm left a pristine silence that settled over the longhouse and the surrounding fields. The villagers stepped out, their boots sinking into the softened snow, each footprint a reminder of the night's hesitant cooperation. The grain barrels, though diminished, still held enough to see the village through the remaining weeks, a testament to the modest generosity that had averted desperation. Watching the sun rise over the frost-kissed roofs, the elders reflected on how the cold had revealed both the fragility of provision and the sturdiness of communal bonds. In the quiet after the storm, the longhouse stood as a warm rectangle against the white, a simple monument to human imperfection, softened by shared endurance. The first snow of the season settled over the valley, coating the thatched roofs in a mute blanket of white. Within the communal longhouse, the hearth glowed orange, its smoke curling through the low doorway like a slow sigh. Elders and youths alike pressed their hands to the cold timber, feeling the pulse of generations that had gathered here each winter. Outside, the wind whispered through the bare birches, carrying the faint creak of doors that had not yet been shut for the night. The village moved as a single organism, each breath syncing with the rhythm of the slow, cold day. As the day waned, a sharp debate rose over the stack of split logs in the corner, some claiming the newest beams were needed for the fire, others insisting they were reserved for the night watch. Voices cracked like frozen twigs, and the iron hinges of the longhouse doors rattled with each raised hand. A pack of wolves slipped silently along the ridge, their silhouettes briefly illuminated by the hearth's flicker as they circled the perimeter. The scent of pine and damp earth mingled with the low murmurs of fear, tightening the air around the timber walls. Mothers pulled their children closer, while the men exchanged uneasy glances, aware that the shelter's safety depended on a fragile agreement. The cold seeped through the cracks, making every breath visible, a reminder of the thin line between comfort and exposure. Yet the argument turned oddly humorous as the youngest carpenter laughed about measuring firewood with a ruler borrowed from the baker's flour sack. The baker, wiping flour from his knuckles, offered stale loaves as bargaining chips, his voice soft as the snow outside. The wolves, indifferent to the barter, lingered beyond the tree line, their eyes glinting like distant lanterns. An old weaver, eyes half closed, remarked that even the wolves seemed more disciplined than the villagers in their clamor for warmth. The irony lingered in the crackling fire, which cast dancing shadows that made the disputes appear as fleeting as smoke. When the last log was finally placed, the community settled into a quiet chorus of shared tasks. The blacksmith knelt near the hearth, shaping iron hooks to reinforce the door, while the healer stitched a scar on a child's cheek with steady hands. A young hunter stood at the doorway, his bow resting against the wall, and whispered a soft warning to the wolves, who paused before retreating into the woods. Together, they arranged a rotating watch, each taking a turn to tend the fire and listen for any howl that might breach the night. The longhouse settled into a steady warmth, the scent of burning wood mingling with the faint aroma of herbal stew simmering in a corner pot. Outside, the wind sighed again, but now it sounded less like a threat and more like a lullaby. In the stillness that followed, the villagers felt the weight of the night lift, replaced by a gentle gratitude for the shelter they had built together. The longhouse, with its soot-stained beams and quiet breaths, stood as a testament to the patience required to mend frayed ties. Even the wolves, unseen beyond the tree line, seemed to acknowledge the calm, their distant howls fading into the background like a forgotten song. As the embers dimmed, elders recalled earlier winters where discord had broken the hearth, and they smiled at how this season's test had reshaped their unity. The night deepened, wrapping the village in a soft, beige glow, and the people drifted to sleep, their dreams cradled by the steady pulse of wood and wind. The winter wind had begun to howl across the low hills, scattering thin sheets of snow over the thatched roofs of the longhouse. Inside, the hearth glowed low, its ember-bright warmth barely reaching the far end where the night guard shifted his boots. Outside, wolves paced the perimeter, their breath fogging the air like pale ghosts. The village elder, his beard dusted with frost, pressed his palm against the wood and felt the tremor of the building, a quiet reminder of its age. With a measured sigh, he called the villagers to gather, his voice a calm ripple against the storm's roar. Soon the blacksmith's hammer rang louder than the wind, each strike sending sparks that flickered across the dim interior like frantic fireflies. The herbalist moved between bundles of dried sage, crushing leaves between calloused fingers, while the scent of mint rose to mingle with the smoke. A shepherd ushered restless goats and shivering lambs into the longhouse, their hooves clacking on the packed earth floor as they found uneasy shelter. Tension rose as the storm thinned the wooden walls, and the old beams creaked under the pressure of snow piled upon the roof. Yet each villager worked with a steadiness that suggested the night itself was merely a passing inconvenience. When the elder finally ignited the massive communal fire, a sudden blaze leapt up, swallowing the dry kindling with a roar that startled the wolves beyond the doorway. Their howls softened, turned into distant echoes as the bright orange light pushed the darkness back, almost as if the flames were a polite reminder that the house was not to be disturbed. The blacksmith, now wiping soot from his forearms, chuckled softly at the irony of a single fire keeping both beast and weather at bay. The shepherd, cradling a trembling kitten rescued from the loft, whispered that even the most stubborn animals prefer warmth to warning. In that moment, the longhouse seemed less a shelter and more a stage where ordinary tasks performed a quiet drama. With the wolves deterred and the storm's fury muted, the longhouse settled into a steady hush. The fire's crackle became a gentle metronome for tired hands. Villagers gathered around the hearth, sharing flat bread and steaming broth, their faces illuminated by a soft amber glow that softened the lines of fatigue. The elder, seated on a low stool, watched the flickering flames as if reading an old manuscript, his eyes reflecting the steady rise of heat. The herbalist handed a poultice to a child whose cheek was flushed from the cold, and the blacksmith rested his hammer against the bench, the metal now warm to the touch. The shepherd stroked the head of a lamb, its breath slow and even, while outside the wind whispered through gaps, barely audible. When dawn finally brushed the horizon with a pale gray, the longhouse stood quiet, its wooden beams still bearing the faint imprint of the night's pressure. The villagers emerged one by one, their cloaks dusted with snow, moving with the deliberate pace of those who have endured and learned. The elder lingered a moment longer at the dying fire, feeling the residual warmth linger like a memory, and he allowed himself a small smile at the simple resilience of his people. The blacksmith examined his newly forged tools, noting the subtle bend that would soon be smoothed by use, a reminder that perfection is never required for survival. As the village returned to its daily rhythm, the longhouse remained a steady heart, its walls echoing the quiet lesson that communal fire, both literal and metaphorical, sustains more than just bodies. It holds the soft humor of human endurance. When the last thick sheet of ice gave way to the slow, amber light of early spring, the villagers of Eldermore stepped out of their fur coats and onto the damp earth beside the longhouse. The timber walls, dark with winter soot, glistened as a thin mist rose from the thawing ground. Children pressed their noses to the low window panes, watching the water melt into rivulets that traced familiar paths along the floorboards. The scent of wet straw mixed with the faint aroma of pine smoke that still lingered from the night watches. In the collective breath of the community, a quiet resolve settled, as if the building itself were inhaling the new season. Yet the thaw brought a subtle tension. The cold had left the timbers weary, and the longhouse creaked as the wind nudged its eaves. Men furrowed their brows while shuffling bundles of firewood, aware that the dwindling supplies might not sustain the lingering chill. The hearth, a shallow pit of blackened stone, emitted a hesitant glow, its flames flickering like nervous hands. Elder women tightened the woven furs that lay across benches, feeling the rough texture of wool against their skin. In the shadows, a stray mouse scurried, reminding everyone that even the smallest lives sensed the lingering uncertainty. Ironically, the very act of sharing the scarce fire seemed to soften the longhouse's apprehension, as if the communal heat soothed the timber's fatigue. While a young apprentice slipped on a slick patch of thawing mud and spilled a cup of millet broth, the spilled liquid traced a bright line across the stone floor, catching the light in a brief, humorous sparkle. Laughter rose, low and hesitant, from the women as they handed him a ragged cloth to wipe the mess, their fingers brushing the damp fabric with a practiced ease. The sound of the spilling broth echoed softly, mingling with the sigh of the wind through the eaves, turning a moment of clumsiness into a quiet affirmation of shared humanity. Even the longhouse, with its weathered joints, seemed to settle deeper into the earth, as though accepting the inadvertent lesson. As the sun lowered, casting a warm amber hue across the interior, the villagers gathered around the hearth, their faces lit by the steady glow. Rough spun tunics and woolen skirts rustled as hands passed coarse bread, smoked fish, and mugs of weak ale, the clink of metal against wood marking each exchange. The low murmur of conversation blended with the crackle of fire, a rhythm that matched the subtle beat of a drum in a corner. barely audible but comforting. Children curled up on woven mats, their eyes half closed, while the elders traced patterns in the soot, their fingers remembering each line. In that shared stillness, the longhouse stood firm, its roof sheltering the soft sighs of a community that had endured the frost together. When the final ember dimmed and the night deepened, the older men and women lingered near the doorway, their voices low as they recounted the winter's trials to the younger listeners. Their words brushed the cold stone, a gentle reminder that cooperation had kept the longhouse intact, and that each grain of thatched roof had been set by many hands. The scent of lingering smoke faded, leaving only the faint, earthy smell of damp timber that seemed to hold the memory of seasons past. As the stars pierced the clear sky, the villagers stepped back into the softened earth, feeling the coolness under their boots, a reminder of the world beyond the walls. In that quiet departure, the promise of spring lingered like a soft breath, promising that the longhouse would shelter generations yet to come. In the early light of spring, the valley of Alderford glistened with thawing mist that clung to low hills. The villagers, their feet still damp from the river, gathered in a clearing where reeds rose like green spears. Together they bent the flexible stalks, binding them with twine, while the sound of water splashing over stones marked the rhythm of their work. Young Tomas, apprentice mason with calloused palms, watched the modest straw huts rise, their thatch roofs puffed by a gentle breeze. The temporary shelters were meant only for the weeks when the soil was soft enough to receive new foundations. Yet, even as the huts took shape, a faint draft hinted at the larger stone hall that would one day dominate the horizon. As the days lengthened, unexpected rains fell, turning the meadow into a slick expanse that soaked the thatch. The straw bundles grew heavy with moisture, and the villagers struggled to keep the walls upright while mud splattered their boots. Tomas felt the weight of each knot he tied, the rope biting his fingertips as the wind picked up, shaking the fragile roofs. Whispers spread through the crowd about the looming winter, and the need for a sturdier shelter grew louder than the creaking of the straw. The foreman, a weathered man named Ulrich, gestured toward the distant quarry, reminding everyone that the stone hall could not wait forever. The tension between the fleeting straw and the permanent stone began to settle like a low hum in the valley air. Under the gray clouds, the peasants laughed quietly as they tried to secure a roof that would likely collapse under its own weight. A farmer named Mara joked that the straw hut was a temporary palace, while a child tossed a loose bundle into the air, watching it flutter like a tired banner. Tomas, whose hands were already stained with mortar from previous projects, remarked that building a flimsy shelter was the most earnest rehearsal for the stone hall. The irony lay in the careful precision applied to something meant to be discarded within a month, as if the villagers were rehearsing permanence with impermanence. Even the village dog, curled at the edge of the construction, seemed to sigh, its tail thumping the damp earth in a rhythm that matched the villagers' subdued chuckles. The scene held a quiet humor, a reminder that human effort often outlives the objects it fashions. By late May, the rain subsided, and the meadows scent softened to warm earth and cut grass. Stone masons arrived with shovels, their boots striking the ground in measured thuds as they laid the first dry stone walls for the hall. Tomas stood beside them, feeling the cool grit of limestone against his palm, hearing the faint echo of chisels shaping each block. The villagers, now accustomed to the rhythmic labor, passed water in wooden troughs, their conversation a low murmur that blended with the distant song of cicadas. In the calm that settled over the clearing, the temporary straw huts faded into the background, their silhouettes softening as the stone foundations claimed the sunrise. As the sun slipped toward the western ridge, Tomas lingered by the unfinished wall, watching shadows stretch across the newly placed stones. He recalled the frantic tying of reeds, the laughter over damp thatch, and the quiet determination that had guided each hand's motion. The stone hall, still rising, seemed to promise a steadier future, yet the memory of the straw huts lingered like a soft aftertaste of spring. He felt a gentle melancholy in the knowledge that every sturdy structure began with a fragile idea, a lesson the valley had whispered through wind and water. The villagers returned to their daily chores, their silhouettes merging with the amber glow, embodying the patient cadence of countless seasons. In that lingering light, Tomas understood that the true foundation was not stone nor straw, but the steady rhythm of human hands working together. When the wheat swayed golden in the late July sun, Tomas slipped his weathered hand over the stalks and felt the harvest's weight settle like a quiet promise. The village council had marked the limestone quarry as the next communal task, and the men gathered beside the thrashing floor, their voices low as they spoke of stone and the need for sturdy walls. Tomas' wife, Mara, handed him a loaf still warm, the crust crackling softly, a reminder that meals must be carried even when work calls. Children lingered at the edge of the field, their laughter a distant ripple against the steady rustle of grain. The decision to leave the cool shade of the wheat for the dusty heat of the quarry settled over the group like a gentle, inevitable tide. The road to the quarry stretched across sun-baked plains, the earth radiating a heat that lifted faint mirages from the horizon. Along the way, Tomas sensed the presence of a rival crew from the neighboring manor, their carts already dusted with limestone, their men humming a low, competitive chant. The air thrummed with the clatter of wooden wheels and the occasional sharp crack of a stone slipping from a horse's harness. Sweat traced pale rivers down each man's back, and the scent of cracked earth mixed with the faint perfume of wild thyme. Tension lingered, not in angry shouts, but in the quiet awareness that the quarry's bounty would be shared among many thirsty hands. At the quarry's mouth, rows of limestone blocks lay like sleeping giants, their pale surfaces slick with sun-warmed dust. Tomas lifted a small piece of straw, its fibers soft and familiar, and compared it to the rough, weighty stone, noting the absurdity of swapping the lightness of harvest for the stubbornness of rock. A jovial chuckle escaped one of the younger workers as he slipped, sending a slab wobbling only to settle with a muted thud. A reminder that even the hardest stone can be humbled by a careless foot. The overseer, with a face half hidden by a wide-brimmed hat, gestured toward the larger blocks, his voice carrying a calm urgency. The irony of their situation, trading the fleeting bounty of grain for the enduring patience of stone, hung in the air like a thin veil of dust. With the day's heat waning toward a softer amber, the men arranged the stones onto sturdy wooden sleds, their hands brushing the cool limestone, feeling the subtle vibration of each block's interior. The rhythmic creak of the sleds on the packed path merged with distant cicada songs, creating a lullaby of labor and landscape. Tomas rested his forearm on a sled, feeling the stone's steady, unyielding pulse, and allowed his thoughts to drift as the village's thatched roofs grew nearer in the distance. The carts moved at a measured pace, the load shifting gently, as if the stone itself understood the need for patience. By the time they reached the village square, the sky had deepened to a dusky rose, and the laborers set the blocks down with a soft sigh of relief. Night settled over the fields, the air cooling in a quiet sigh that brushed against the stone walls, now beginning to rise around the humble homes. Tomas sat on the low stone bench outside his cottage, the faint glow of a single oil lamp casting elongated shadows that softened the lines of his day-worn face. He listened to the distant murmur of neighbors sharing simple meals, the clink of wooden bowls, and the occasional low laugh, each sound a gentle affirmation of shared effort. The quarry's stone, once distant and daunting, now rested within reach, its presence a quiet testament to perseverance, and the subtle trade-off between fleeting harvest and lasting shelter. As fireflies flickered above the thatch, Tomas felt the day's labor settle into his bones, a calm gratitude lingering like the last warm breath of summer when the first amber chill brushed the thatched roofs. The village gathered around the central yard, their hands still dusted with straw shavings from the summer walls. Women carried bundles of dry reeds, their fingertips feeling the papery texture as they stacked them near the open hearth. Men in rough wool coats examined the loose stones that had been set aside, feeling the cold weight of each slab against the palm of their forearms. A low murmur rose as the elder of the lane whispered plans to replace the fragile straw with sturdier stone before frost hardened the ground. The air held a quiet anticipation, a slow breath before the inevitable change. Soon after, sudden rain drummed against the wooden shutters, soaking the earth and turning familiar footpaths into slick ribbons of mud. The supply carts returned half empty, their wheels squeaking under the weight of unfulfilled promises, while the stone masons argued over the best method to cut the rough blocks in damp conditions. Voices rose just enough to disturb the rhythm of the dripping eaves, each dispute echoing against the stillness of the partly completed walls. Children watched from the doorway, their small hands tracing the cold stone, feeling the chill seep into their sleeves. Yet the village continued, each hammer strike a measured response to the mounting pressure of weather and scarcity. An irony settled over the work as the new stone walls, supposed to bring permanence, seemed to mock the old straw that swayed harmlessly with every gust. A mason, distracted by the taste of stale rye bread, slipped on a slick stone and landed with a soft thud, the sound oddly muffled compared to the crisp crack of straw snapping under a child's foot. Laughter, low and weary, rose from the group, not from triumph, but from the recognition that their effort was as fragile as the weather itself. The rain paused, letting a thin sunbeam cut through the clouds, glinting off a loose pebble that rolled gently across the damp ground. In that quiet moment, the villagers shared a brief smile, aware of the small absurdity of battling nature with stone and stubbornness. As evening settled, the rain gave way to a calm mist that cloaked the courtyard in a soft, gray veil. The fire in the communal hearth crackled, its glow painting warm orange patterns on the stone that now rose like a quiet monument. Hands that had bruised from labor rested on worn benches, feeling the smooth, cool surface of the newly laid walls. Soft conversation drifted, voices low enough that the rustle of wool and the occasional clink of a spoon against a wooden bowl were the dominant sounds. The villagers, though tired, moved with a measured grace, each step echoing a collective acceptance of the day's work and the coming cold. When the first frost settled on the stone, turning its surface to a pale sheen, the villagers stood back and observed the transformation with a calm reverence. The old straw, now folded and stored, smelled of earth and memories, while the stone walls held a quiet promise of shelter against winter's bite. In the stillness, the elder traced the outline of a stone with a weathered finger, feeling the minute roughness that spoke of countless hands that had shaped it. The night wind whispered through the cracks, reminding everyone that even the strongest constructions are vulnerable to time. Yet the people carried forward, their steps measured, their thoughts lingering on how a simple change of material reflected a deeper, patient endurance woven through generations. When the first breath of winter settled over the valley, the thatched roofs exhaled a thin plume of smoke, and the villagers gathered beneath the half-built stone hall, their hands still raw from the cold. Tomas, whose fingers were stained with lime, measured the last rows of limestone blocks, feeling the roughness of each stone as if it were a promise. The mortar, mixed with freshly thawed water, sat in a wooden trough, its surface shivering in the frosty air. Children huddled near the fire, their eyes reflecting the orange glow, while the older women wrapped their shawls tighter around shoulders that ached from years of labor. In that quiet assembly, the community sensed a collective resolve, a patient rhythm that matched the slow drip of icicles forming on the eaves. Midnight arrived with a wind that rattled the unfinished walls, and the sky darkened to a bruised indigo, urging the hearth flames to flicker higher. The storm pressed against the skeletal roof, a relentless drum on the wooden scaffolding, while the frozen mortar hardened unevenly, cracking under the sudden weight of snow. Tomas steadied his breath, feeling the chill seep through his coat, and he pressed a cold stone into place, hearing the sharp, brittle snap that echoed like a distant bell. The villagers shouted low commands, the sound swallowed by the gusts, as they hauled hardened stones across slick ground, each step a careful negotiation with the ice. The tension hung like a thin veil, thin enough to be brushed aside, but heavy enough to press on their shoulders. Strangely, the storm that threatened to undo their work also lent a stubborn permanence to the mortar, its frozen state sealing the stones with a quiet firmness the peasants had not anticipated. Tomas, who had feared the cold would shatter their efforts, found the very ice acting as an unwitting ally. The crackle of the fire beside him sounding less like a threat and more like a subtle applause. The villagers exchanged weary smiles, their faces half hidden by wool, the irony of nature's harshness delivering unexpected aid settling in their eyes. As the wind howled, a stray ember slipped from the hearth, landing on a dry bundle of straw. Yet the surrounding snow muffled the ember's potential blaze, turning what could have been disaster into a muted sigh. In that moment, the absurdity of their struggle seemed both fragile and resilient. A quiet joke whispered by the landscape itself. When dawn finally broke, the storm retreated, leaving a hushed white blanket that softened the clatter of tools and the echo of footsteps. The roof, now capped with the final row of fire-hardened stones, rested under a gentle layer of fresh snow that cushioned each edge with a subtle, muffled quiet. Tomas brushed his hands on the cold stone, feeling the smoothness of a surface that had survived both flame and frost. And the villagers gathered around, sharing warm broth that steamed in the pale light. The fire inside the hall crackled softly, its glow painting the interior walls with amber shadows that swayed like slow breathing. In this calm, the community sensed a rhythm that matched the slow turn of the sun, a measured peace that settled over the hall like a sigh. Later, as the last embers dimmed and the snow fell in a steady, silent curtain, Tomas lingered by the doorway, his eyes tracing the line where stone met sky. He thought of the labor that had stitched each block together, each imperfect hand that had placed a piece, and of the quiet way the world had both challenged and aided them. The hall stood not as a monument of grandeur, but as a testament to ordinary perseverance, its walls echoing faintly with the footfalls of those who had built it. The villagers retreated to their huts, the scent of rye bread drifting through the cold, and the night wrapped the village in a gentle darkness that felt less like an ending and more like a pause. In that lingering stillness, the memory of the winter's forge settled into the collective heart, a soft reminder that even the most arduous tasks are woven from moments of quiet resolve. When the thaw loosened the river's ice, Tomas walked the field with a bundle of fresh straw, the scent of damp earth rising with each step. Children gathered the stalks, their fingers brushing the rough thatch, while the older women watched the sunrise turn the sky a soft amber. The village had spent the winter shaping stones, and the new beam of light seemed to promise a hall that would hold the season's work. Tomas measured the foundations with a wooden ruler, his voice low and steady as he recited the dimensions the masons had sketched on parchment. By midday, the first stones were set, their cool surfaces contrasting with the warm breath of the newly awakened meadow. The air carried a quiet anticipation, as if the land itself were waiting for the final stone to seal the spring's renewal. As the days lengthened, the rain slipped over the stone walls, leaving a thin veil of mist that softened the edges of the half-finished hall. The masons struggled with a stubborn slab that refused to settle, its weight pressing against the mortar with a stubborn sigh. Tomas felt the tension rise in his shoulders, the ache of each lift echoing the strain of his own age. The village children, once carefree, now paused their games to listen to the occasional clatter of tools, a reminder that progress demanded patience. By the time the sun slipped behind the hill, final stone was perched on the lintel, its surface still damp, but holding the promise of shelter. When the stone hall finally stood, the villagers gathered to admire the work. Yet the celebration was tinged with an easy irony. The grand entrance, meant for feasts and gatherings, opened onto a narrow courtyard that still smelled of fresh straw and rain-soaked dust. Tomas chuckled softly as a goat nudged its head through the doorway, its hooves clacking against the rough floorboards, a humble reminder that grandeur and everyday life often share the same threshold. The mayor raised a half-filled cup of ale, its froth spilling over the edge, while the baker offered a loaf still warm from the hearth, its crust cracking under a gentle hand. Laughter drifted through the hall, mingling with the distant clink of metal and the soft rustle of wind through the thatch roof. A chorus that seemed to acknowledge the gap between ambition and the modest reality of peasant life. The evening settled into a mellow hush, the stone walls absorbing the amber glow of torches that flickered like fireflies caught in a glass case. Villagers settled onto low benches, their hands resting on cool stone, the fragrance of roasted root vegetables drifting through the air. A lute player plucked a slow melody, each note resonating against the sturdy arches, while the children whispered stories of the coming harvest in quiet reverence. Tomas watched the scene from a shadowed corner, his breath steady as the fire's heat brushed his cheek, feeling the stone's solidity beneath his feet. The celebration unfolded without fanfare, an ordinary communion of food, song, and shared silence that honored the labor of many hands. When the last ember faded, Tomas lingered near the newly erected doorway, his eyes tracing the pattern of stones that had taken months to align. He sensed the continuity of seasons, how the straw of winter had given way to the stone of spring, each layer a quiet testament to human perseverance. In the stillness, the village seemed to exhale. The weight of the work settled like a blanket over the land. Tomas's thoughts turned to the children who would grow beneath this roof, their footsteps echoing a future that might never know the same hardships. A soft smile curved his lips as he imagined the hall witnessing countless cycles, each one a modest triumph against time's inevitable flow. The night settled, and the stone hall, steadfast and unadorned, stood as a calm witness to the unremarkable, yet profound rhythm of medieval life. When the first frost painted the fields of Brackenfield in a thin veil of white, Mara slipped the cracked shutters open to feel the bite of wind threading through the thatch. Joran, already half asleep, heard the soft drip of melted snow finding its way through a loosened ridge tile, a quiet reminder that the roof was surrendering to the cold. Inside the single stone hearth, The ember's glow fought a steady, thin breath of chill that seemed to pull the night back toward darkness. Their breath fogged the low-ceilinged room as the fire cracked, a fragile heart beating against the winter's advance. The day had begun with a muted urgency, prompting both to consider how the hearth might hold the cold at bay for another night. Soon the wind grew sharper, rattling the shutters and urging the smoke to curl thinly from the hearth like a pale breath. Mara shuffled to the stacked bundles of oak, fingers numb as they brushed the rough bark, only to find the outermost logs damp from the night's dew. Joran struck a flint, listening to the quiet sigh of the spark that struggled to catch, while the room's walls seemed to lean inward, absorbing the creeping draft. Their attempts to kindle a brighter flame were met with a stubborn dampness that seeped into the kindling, rendering each effort a quiet test of patience. The growing cold pressed against the stone floor, urging the pair to look beyond the ordinary means of warmth. At the far end of the lane, old Hilda appeared with a basket of freshly cut firewood, her smile folded under a shawl that whispered of many winters. She offered the wood and a place beside her larger hearth, a gesture both generous and oddly inconvenient, for sharing meant leaving their modest cottage and entering a communal space. Mara, proud of her modest household, declined with a soft nod, preferring the solitude of their own hearth despite its frailty. Joran, meanwhile, stared at the ember's faint flicker, noting the irony that the very wood meant to warm their home had become the source of their lingering chill. The moment lingered, a quiet tableau of human pride balanced against the pragmatic need for heat. Returning to the hearth, Joran spread a thin layer of damp clay he had saved from the potter's waste, pressing it around the firebox to seal the drafts that gnawed at the flame. Mara draped a coarse woolen blanket over the stone ribs, the fabric humming with a soft warmth as it caught the lingering heat. The ember, now insulated, glowed steadier, its orange tongue licking the clay without the previous shiver of cold air. A gentle crackle rose, filling the room with a muted rhythm that matched the slow ticking of the oil lamp beside the window. In the quiet that settled, the couple felt a subtle satisfaction, as if the simple act of mending had coaxed the hearth back into a patient partnership with the winter. As night deepened, the village lay under a blanket of stillness, the wind sighing beyond the fence lines, while the hearth's glow painted soft shadows on the rough walls. Mara and Joran sat side by side, hands warm against the stone, their thoughts turning inward to the modest resilience that had carried them through the first frost. The moment felt timeless, a reminder that survival often rests on the unremarkable gestures of repair and acceptance rather than grand feats. In the hush, they sensed a quiet bond with their neighbors, each dwelling quietly battling the same cold, each hearth a small beacon of endurance. The night passed gently, leaving behind the faint scent of smoke and the lingering lesson that warmth, once coaxed, can linger long after the storm has faded. In the first breath of winter, the village square gathered beneath a low, overcast sky, the air already tasting of frost. Elder women laid out weathered wooden tablets, their pages stained by years of soot, and whispered the names of long forgotten hearth designs. Young men, sleeves rolled to the elbows, listened as the cadence of their voices rose and fell like the slow crackle of a dwindling fire. The scent of damp wool mingled with the sharp bite of cold, anchoring each listener to the shared purpose of survival. As the sun sank low, a quiet resolve settled over the crowd, a collective promise to keep the hearths alight through the dark months ahead. Soon the conversation turned to the pressing scarcity that gnawed at the village's edge. The forest, once a dense veil of pine and oak, now stood thin, its trunks skeletal against the winter wind, and the timber that fed the hearths was being felled faster than it could regrow. Hands traced the outlines of a proposed double-walled hearth, its inner cavity promising to hold heat longer. Yet the plans required more timber than the trees could supply. A murmur rose as some thought of alternative fuels, eyes flickering to the distant bog where peat lay dark and heavy under a thin veil of ice. The tension in the air was palpable, a low hum akin to the distant rumble of a storm yet to arrive. Irony slipped in, unnoticed at first, as the villagers waded into the bog, their boots sinking into the soft, cold mud, each step echoing the absurdity of seeking warmth from earth's damp heart. They harvested long, black blocks of peat, their surfaces slick with frost, and stacked them beside the hearths, a stark contrast to the dry, crackling wood they were accustomed to. In the barn, straw was spread on the sun-warmed floor, its golden fibers drying slowly as a thin winter sun filtered through cracked shutters. A reminder that even under a cold sky, light could still coax moisture away. The villagers laughed softly when a sack of peat slipped, spilling its dark contents onto the frosted stone, a clatter that sounded like a muted drumbeat. The scene unfolded with a gentle humor, the community's perseverance shimmering amid the practical absurdities of their choices. When the first double-walled hearth was finally lit, the fire settled into a deep, orange glow that seemed to breathe its own rhythm, the walls radiating a steady warmth that lingered longer than any previous blaze. Smoke rose in thin, graceful ribbons, its scent of pine and peat intertwining, while the villagers felt the heat kiss their fingertips and the chill retreat from their shoulders. Children curled beside the embers, their faces soft and slightly bored, eyes half closed as they listened to the crackling chorus that filled the room. The peat burned slowly, its dark ash a quiet testament to perseverance, while the dried straw in the barn crackled with a brighter, swift flare, offering brief bursts of heat. In that calm, the village seemed to exhale, the harsh winter outside muffled by the sturdy walls, and the steady pulse of fire within. As weeks slipped into months, the hearths became silent witnesses to the rhythm of daily life, their glow marking meals, stories, and the occasional moment of quiet contemplation. Elders, now older still, would trace the contours of the double-walled stones with weathered fingers, recalling the urgency of that first winter and the unexpected comfort found in peat and straw. The memory of the forest's thinning lingered, a gentle melancholy that reminded the villagers of the balance between taking and giving. Yet the fire's enduring warmth offered a quiet reassurance that human ingenuity, however modest, could coax steadiness from scarcity. In the soft amber light, the village settled into a timeless pause, each breath a reminder of the fragile yet resilient thread that ties past to future. When the winter wind first turned the river into a gray ribbon of ice, the village of Eldenford settled into its familiar rhythm. Smoke curled lazily from the thatch-roofed cottages, and children traced faint patterns on the frosted windows. Mara and Joran, like many of their neighbors, gathered the day's scant peat in wicker baskets, the dry scent mingling with the cold breath of the hearth. The sky held a muted amber, as if the sun were tired, and the distant clatter of cart wheels faded into the hush of snowfall. Life moved with a measured patience, each heartbeat echoing the gentle creak of timber beams. In this quiet opening, the community felt the ordinary comfort of shared warmth, unaware of the storm that would soon test their resolve. Midway through the week, the storm thickened, burying the main road beneath drifts that swallowed carts and cut off the distant forest where wood was normally harvested. The communal peat pile, once a generous mound, shrank to a brittle slab, and murmurs grew into low arguments as families debated who should receive the remaining pieces. Mara heard the crack of a splintered board as Joran tried to pry a log from the frozen wall, his breath forming pale clouds that seemed to hiss with frustration. The cold seeped through cracks in the walls, turning the interior air into a thin, damp veil that clung to skin. Tension lingered like the lingering cold, making each shared glance feel edged with the need for survival. Amid the rising pressure, an odd solution surfaced. Joran, with a careful hand, began melting rendered animal fat from the few preserved pigs and drizzling it over the damp peat, hoping the oily sheen would make the fire burn longer. The villagers watched, half amused and half skeptical, as the fat sizzled and released a faint, sweet aroma that momentarily lifted the gloom. Mara, noting the irony, set out at night across the frozen river, her boots scraping on the brittle ice to retrieve logs that had frozen solid like accidental candles. The river's surface reflected a dim moon, and the effort felt both absurd and dignified, as if the act of gathering hardened wood was a quiet rebellion against the storm's tyranny. Their small experiments, strange as they were, wove a thread of laughter through the bleakness, showing how ingenuity could flicker even in the darkest frost. By the following dawn, the hearth glowed steadier, the fat enhanced peat giving off a mellow heat that softened the wooden beams and coaxed a sigh from the villagers' throats. Mara returned with a stack of ice-hardened logs, their surfaces smooth and dark, and placed them beside the fire, where they released a steady crackle that filled the room with a comforting rhythm. Joran shared the remaining fat, pouring it into a shallow tin that glistened under the weak light, and the community gathered, hands warm around mugs of thin broth, eyes half closed in a collective ease. The storm outside persisted, but within the wall, the air held a gentle, lingering warmth that seemed to pulse in time with the slow beat of heartbeats. In this calm, the earlier discord faded like steam, replaced by a quiet appreciation for the modest triumphs of perseverance. When the snow finally thinned and the road reopened, the villagers walked back toward the forest, each footstep a reminder of the season's stubborn grip. They carried with them not only the remaining logs, but also a memory of how scarcity had coaxed unexpected cooperation, how a simple drip of animal fat could stretch a dwindling resource into a night of shared comfort. Mara reflected on the cracked ice of the river, noting how it had hardened the wood and, in turn, softened the community's resolve. Joran, while mending a broken fence, thought of the fire's lingering scent and the subtle humor in their collective adaptation. The village settled back into its rhythm, carrying forward the quiet lesson that even the harshest winters offer a space for modest ingenuity and gentle reflection. The winter of 1247 arrived with a wind that scraped the low thatched roofs of the hamlet like a relentless hand. Snow piled against the crooked doors, and the villagers could feel the cold seeping through the cracks of their timber walls. When a sudden blizzard thickened, the roof of the communal barn began to sag under the weight of wet thatch. Mothers tightened woolen shawls around their shoulders, while children pressed their small hands against frosted windows, watching the gray world contract. In the dim glow of the hearth, an elder whispered that the night would test the village's shared breath. As the storm intensified, The usual supplies of firewood dwindled, leaving only splintered logs and damp peat in the storehouse. The men gathered in the courtyard, their breath forming clouds, and debated how to stretch the meager fuel enough for the night. A baker offered his discarded rye husks, while a herder contributed sacks of animal fat that had hardened in the cold. The communal pot was hoisted onto a stone platform, and the first sparks crackled, sending a thin ribbon of orange into the dark. Yet the wind howled through the gaps, threatening to smother the fledgling flame before it could kindle hope. In a moment of quiet ingenuity, a group of women wove reeds into a crude screen, positioning it like a wind shield that sang with each gust. The improvised barrier caught the fiercest blasts, forcing the chill to swirl away, while the fire hungrily drank the offered fat and peat. It was oddly comical to see the villagers, clad in mud-stained cloaks, huddling around a massive pit that resembled a shallow lake of flame. Laughter soft, breathy escaped as the flames licked higher than any hearth they had known, turning the courtyard into an accidental celebration. The irony lay in the simplicity of the solution. A handful of reeds and shared leftovers created more warmth than the Lord's stored granaries could promise. The fire grew steady, radiating a gentle orange that painted the stone walls with a comforting hue. Children, their cheeks flushed, sat on straw mats, listening to the crackle as if it were a lullaby for the night. The heat slipped through the cracks of each home, coaxing frozen shutters to swing open and revealing modest interiors bathed in soft light. The villagers fell into a quiet rhythm, mending tools, sharing thin broth, and feeling the collective pulse of survival steady beneath the blaze. Outside, the blizzard continued, but its fury seemed muted against the steady glow that held the settlement together. When the storm finally loosened, the thatch of the barn remained intact, held by the unseen strength of shared effort. The peasants lingered near the dying embers, their hands still warm, contemplating how a simple act of pooling resources had become a lifeline. Elderly eyes, dim but bright, noted that the reeds would soon be replaced. Yet the memory of the fire would linger through future winters. In the calm that followed, the village recognized that unity could forge a hearth larger than any individual stove, a lesson etched into the grain of their wooden beams. As night fell deeper, a soft silence settled, and the hamlet drifted toward sleep, cradled by the lingering warmth of a communal blaze. The first light of spring slipped over the ridge, melting the hoarfrost that had clung to the thatch roofs for months. Villagers emerged from their cramped quarters, their breath still visible in the lingering chill, and the faint scent of damp earth rose from the thawing fields. Mara slipped a loose stone from the doorframe, feeling the stone cool beneath her palm as she stepped onto the softened soil. Joran, carrying a bundle of fresh firewood, watched the sunrise paint the sky a gentle amber, each ray coaxing the frost away from the stone walls. Together, they nodded to a day that promised work, yet already whispered of the warmth that the shared hearth would soon bring. The wind that followed carried a sharp bite, rattling the cracked panes of the communal longhouse, as if urging the villagers to shelter. Inside, the embers from the winter fire lay ember gray, reluctant to flare without fresh tinder, and the floorboards still held the memory of frozen drafts. Mara and Joran exchanged glances, their hands already raw from shaking twine and splintered logs. They set about gathering the last of the dwindling kindling, scraping the soggy straw from the loft, while the low thud of footsteps echoed like a measured drum. Each breath they drew seemed to fog the low ceiling, a reminder that the season's retreat was as fragile as the smoke that curled lazily from the hearth. It was ironic that the very tools meant for winter's struggle, roughly hewn axes and cracked clay pots, became instruments of comfort, their imperfections mirroring the villagers' own. Mara, with an unexpected chuckle, placed a cracked pot beneath the flame, watching the heat bounce off its uneven surface, as if the pot were a stubborn student learning to hold warmth. Joran, meanwhile, layered the firewood in a pattern that resembled a child's scribble. Yet the arrangement coaxed a steady blaze that warmed the stone floor faster than any careful design could promise. The hearth, once a solitary source of heat, now sang a quiet duet of old habit and newfound improvisation, the crackle of the fire sounding like an amused sigh. Neighbors gathered, their cheeks flushed not from cold, but from the soft glow, acknowledging the subtle comedy of survival turned into shared ceremony. As the fire steadied, a hush settled over the longhouse, broken only by the occasional clink of wooden spoons against clay bowls. Children curled near the hearth, the heat brushing their backs, while elders traced the pattern of ash with patient fingers, as if reading a familiar story. Mara handed a steaming loaf to a tired mother, the crust still warm enough to leave a faint imprint on the palm, and Joran quietly repaired a loose hinge with a scrap of leather, his movements deliberate and unhurried. The shared warmth spread outward, reaching the outer rooms where thin curtains fluttered in the soft draft, and the scent of burning wood mingled with the fresh smell of newly sprouted herbs. In that steady glow, the village settled into a rhythm of meals, conversation, and the unspoken agreement that the hearth would remain a center of quiet cooperation. When the first buds pushed through the soil, Mara and Joran gathered the children beneath the hearth's glow to recount the winter's trials. Each tale a gentle reminder of the perseverance that had stitched the community together. They showed the youngsters how to split firewood with the same uneven axe that had once seemed clumsy, letting the splinters fall like soft punctuation in the air. The elders listened, their eyes reflecting the amber flame, while the youngest traced the patterns of ash, learning that the same irregular marks could become a map of shared memory. As the season turned, the hearth's ember dimmed slower than any winter fire had before, a quiet testament that the blended methods forged not only heat, but a lasting tradition. In the lingering glow, the village recognized that warmth was less a battle against cold than a collective breath, steady and measured, forever echoing through the stone walls. The first breath of frost settled on the low hills of Eldermore, turning the river's surface to a thin glass that caught the pale morning light. Villagers, cloaked in homespun wool, drifted toward the ancient oak that marked the village heart, its bark darkened by centuries of wind. There they found Myra, the forester, her hands still stained with pine resin as she surveyed the waning leaves. Bram, the blacksmith, arrived with a clang of his hammer still echoing from the forge, while Leo, the shepherd, cradled a trembling lamb in his arms. Together they sat on rough timber benches, the cold air brushing the tops of their ears, and began to speak of wood, stone, and wool as the day slipped toward noon. A quiet resolve settled among them, like the stillness that precedes snowfall, as they agreed to gather resources before the valley fell silent. The clouds gathered low, their gray weight pressing against the sky, and the wind whispered through the oak's bare branches, rattling the loose leaves like nervous fingers. Myra reported that the nearby forest still held enough standing trunks, but the recent drought had left many saplings brittle, threatening a short supply of firewood. Bram noted the iron bars he had forged earlier were cooling faster than usual, a sign that the forge's furnace would need extra fuel to keep the metal pliant through winter. Leo, glancing at his flock, mentioned that the woolly coats of his ewes were thick, yet the shearing knives dulled quickly in damp hands. A murmur of concern rose among the villagers as they imagined nights when the hearth would sputter and the walls would sigh against the cold. The council, though composed, felt the tightening grip of an unseen hand, urging them to act before the frost hardened the soil. As the men set out with axe and cart, a sudden gust lifted a flock of sparrows, scattering the freshly cut logs across the muddy path, as if the birds mocked their haste. Bram, while loading a bundle, slipped on a slick patch of ice left by overnight frost, his hammer clattering harmlessly into the snow, prompting a quiet chuckle from Myra. Leo tried to dry the wool in the sun, only to watch a stray goat nibble at the fibers, leaving the pile half torn and the shepherd blinking at his own folly. The villagers gathered round the forge, where the fire blazed bright. Yet the wind slipped through the cracks, sending a brief flare of sparks that lit Bram's beard for a moment. Even as the absurd mishaps unfolded, the community continued to stack wood, repair stone walls, and mend roofs, their motions steady despite the occasional slip. The irony lay not in failure, but in the gentle reminder that even careful plans are brushed by clumsy nature. With the sun waning, the villagers moved in a measured rhythm. Myra guided teams to cut and split timber, the sound of axe meeting would echoing like a soft drumbeat across the valley. Bram steadied the forge, feeding coal and shaping iron brackets that would brace the timber frames, his breath forming thin clouds that rose and faded into the dusk. Leo carried bundles of wool to the communal hall, where women wove them into thick blankets by the light of a low candle. The looms click, a quiet companion to the fire's crackle. Stone masons pressed fresh mortar into the gaps of the cottages, feeling the cool grit under their palms, while children shuffled pebbles along the lane, their laughter a muted hum. By nightfall, the village was draped in layers of timber, stone, and wool, each home holding a deeper warmth that whispered against the encroaching cold. The work settled like a sigh, the earlier urgency now a steady pulse that matched the slow turning of the hearth's flame. When the first snow fell, it settled on the reinforced roofs with a muffled hush, and the villagers watched from windows as the world turned white, feeling the safety of their preparations. Inside, the fire burned longer, the iron brackets holding strong, and the woolen blankets kept the chill at bay, turning the cold into a distant visitor rather than an invader. Myra walked the forest edge, noting that the tree trunks she had felled now stood as silent guardians, their stumps cradling the snow like white caps. Bram, his hands roughened by work, rested his hammer against the hearth, listening to the steadiness of metal against fire, a simple rhythm that reminded him of his ancestors' patience. Leo, with his flock huddled close, reflected on how the season's harshness had taught the community to share labor, humor, and quiet resilience. The winter passed in a gentle cadence, leaving behind a village that had learned that preparation is less a triumph than a quiet conversation between people and the inevitable cold. The morning light filtered through the low canopy as Myra assembled her small crew beside the village edge. Their task was simple in description. Harvest the ancient oaks whose trunks promised sturdy beams for the looming winter walls. Axes glinted. The dull thud of metal on wood rang across a quiet clearing, and the scent of sap rose with each fall. Bram, already bearing a satchel of rough hemp rope, lingered to note the direction of the strongest trees. Children whispered from the fringe, their eyes following the rhythmic swing of blades, while the wind whispered a patient promise of cold. By noon, the sky grew heavy, clouds gathering like a gray quilt that smothered the sun. A sudden gust snapped the freshly cut timber, sending splinters skittering across the muddy path. Dark rain hammered the leaves, and the group hurried to a nearby limestone cave, whose mouth yawned darkly, offering tentative protection. Inside, the air was cool and damp, the echo of dripping water competing with the rapid beat of their hearts. Myra tightened her cloak, feeling the cold seep through the thin wool, while Bram counted the remaining nails they had bartered for, aware that each could be lost to the storm. As they settled, a stray beam struck a vein of dark stone, revealing a jagged strip of flint that glittered like misplaced silver. The same flint that could spark fire now lay amidst the shelter's shadows, a reminder that the forest also held hidden gifts. Bram, who had spent the morning bargaining with the neighboring hamlet for iron nails, found the irony of trading metal for stone oddly comforting. The hamlet's messenger, a solemn trader whose face remained blurred by the rain-soaked hood, offered a modest exchange, a few nails for a bundle of dried herbs. Myra chuckled softly at the thought that a storm could both strip their plans and provide the very material to rekindle them. The cave's interior softened with the muffled glow of a small fire. The flint struck repeatedly to coax steady sparks. Warmth spread like a gentle tide, coaxing the cold out of tired muscles as the group arranged the beams against the stone wall, securing them with the salvaged nails. The sound of crackling wood blended with distant thunder, creating a lull that settled over the gathered hands. Myra traced the grain of the oak, feeling its rough texture, and thought of the walls they would raise, sturdy enough to keep the winter at bay. Bram, polishing the iron heads, allowed his eyes to rest on the rhythmic dance of flame, finding a quiet satisfaction in the simple act of repair. When the storm cleared, a pale light seeped into the cave, revealing droplets clinging to the stone like tiny mirrors. The team emerged, their steps measured, each bearing a beam, a nail, or a handful of flint, the forest now seeming less hostile and more a patient collaborator. Back at the village square, the timber was hoisted onto the skeletal frame, the iron nails driven with deliberate care, and the flint set aside for future hearths. Myra watched the walls rise, feeling the slow certainty of progress, a quiet counterpoint to the earlier rush of urgency. In the fading evening, the villagers gathered, sharing soft humor about the unexpected shelter, acknowledging that even the coldest seasons are softened by collective perseverance. When the first breath of autumn tinged the valley with a cooler hue, Leo gathered the village elders beneath the low stone arch and outlined the descent to the high pastures. He traced the winding ridge with a weathered stick, his voice steady as the wind that lifted the woolly heads of the flock. The shepherds listened, feeling the rough texture of their own cloaks and the faint crunch of dried grass underfoot. With each step, the plan grew clearer. The sheep would graze where the sun lingered longer, while the valley families prepared hearths for the coming chill. The day closed with a quiet murmur of agreement, the sky turning a soft amber that seemed to promise a gentle night. A few weeks later, a thin cough slipped through the herd, a sound like wind rustling through dry straw, and the sheep grew listless, their coats damp with feverish sweat. Leo's hands, usually confident on the rope, now trembled as he lifted a shivering ewe and felt the uneven heat of its fevered flank. The villagers, who had already begun spinning extra yarn, found themselves dividing their attention between the sick flock and the half-finished blankets hanging on wooden pegs. Nightly the coughs rose and fell, echoing against the stone walls, while the hearth sputtered with a low, uncertain flame. The cold seeped through cracks, making the floorboards sing with each tentative step, and a quiet tension settled on the narrow lanes of the settlement. In the cramped weaving room, the sound of shuttle beats became a metronome for both hope and irony. The very wool that should have insulated the villagers now required careful nursing as it fell ill. Mothers whispered to the sick lambs as they trimmed fleeces, their fingers brushing the coarse fibers that felt suddenly heavy with unspoken urgency. As the supply of clean yarn dwindled, an old spindle creaked under the weight of a handful of dyed thread, reminding everyone of the thin line between comfort and scarcity. Yet the villagers laughed softly, their smiles muted, as they traded a finished blanket for a handful of herbs to soothe a ewe. Each exchange a quiet acknowledgement of the absurd balance they lived. The air carried a faint scent of peat and salt, mingling with the earthy perfume of damp wool, stitching together the paradox of caring for the very source of their warmth. When the first frost painted the thatch roofs with a pale silver, the community gathered around a long wooden table, the glow of oil lamps casting gentle shadows on weathered faces. Together they wove, the rhythmic click of looms filling the room like a lullaby, while Leo steadied the sick flock with a blanket of his own making, his breath warm against their fur. Children rested their heads on the soft wool, feeling the faint tickle of fibers that had survived both cold and illness. And the elders exchanged stories of past winters, their voices low and steady. As the night deepened, the hearth settled into a steady roar, the heat licking the stone, and the newly finished blankets were folded and stacked, each layer a promise against the bite of the wind outside. The village settled into a tranquil cadence, the earlier anxiety dissolving into a shared sense of quiet accomplishment. Dawn arrived with a pale light that filtered through frosted windows, the air inside still bearing the residual warmth of the communal fire. Leo walked among the pens, his steps soft on the packed earth, observing the sheep now calmer, their coats glistening with a muted sheen that spoke of recovery. The villagers, wrapped in the freshly woven blankets, lingered on doorways, sipping thin broth while the wind whispered against the walls, a reminder of the ever-present frost beyond. In that still moment, the village seemed to breathe as one organism, each heartbeat echoing the patient rhythm of seasons turning. The day closed with a lingering sense that, though scarcity had pressed them, the gentle persistence of ordinary deeds had woven a resilience as warm as the wool they tended. The first light of winter fell over Eldermore, brushing the earth with a thin veil of pale mist. The half-finished stone walls rose like weary ribs, their mortar still damp from the day's work. Myra, whose hands knew the quiet language of timber joints, inspected the wooden scaffolding with a measured eye. Bram, the village smith, polished a curved iron bar, the firelight catching the low hum of his furnace. Leo, younger than the others, gathered the village children at the edge of the orchard, pointing out the best trees for firewood. In the background, the river whispered beneath thin ice, promising a cold that would soon test the settlement. The air held a patient stillness, as if the coming storm were already being counted in quiet breaths. By late afternoon, the sky darkened to a bruised indigo, and the wind began to scrape the thatch roofs with a thin, metallic sigh. Snow fell in thick, silent sheets, piling against the unfinished walls until the mortar drummed with each impact. Suddenly, an immense slab of ice, loosened from the frozen river, cracked and thundered onto the central granary, splintering the roof and spilling cold darkness inside. The sound of timber groaning under weight mixed with the clatter of broken barrels, and a bitter chill seeped through the cracks, biting the skin of any hand that dared to touch it. Myra felt the tremor through the joists. Bram saw the frost coating his iron tools, and Leo heard the distant shouts of the youth scrambling for kindling. The community stood still for a heartbeat, aware that the night would be a test of every stone and ember they had gathered. It was oddly fitting that the very ice which threatened their food also exposed the hidden strength of their modest carpentry. For the granary's wooden braces, long considered decorative, now bore the sudden weight with stubborn resilience. Bram, whose forge had barely warmed in weeks, found that the battered iron bar he had intended for ornamental hinges could be repurposed as a brace against the collapsing beams. The children, initially sent to fetch firewood, discovered that the fallen ice created a shallow pool that reflected the firelight, making the tasks of chopping and hauling feel less like toil and more like a quiet ritual. Leo laughed softly at the sight of snowflakes melting on a hot ember, a reminder that even the cold could be coaxed into serving the hearth. The irony lay not in the disaster itself, but in how the community's overlooked details became the lifeline they needed, turning a moment of loss into a subtle affirmation of their own making. A low murmur of agreement rose from the gathered faces, steady as the wind outside. With the granary exposed, the villagers moved like a slow tide, each person finding a place in the improvised choreography of repair. Myra measured the remaining timber, fitting each joint with soft taps that resonated against the cold stone, while Bram heated the iron in his forge, the glow painting his cheeks a gentle amber. Leo organized the youth into pairs, handing them bundles of spruce that crackled as they were stacked beside the work, their breath fogging in the dim light. The sound of axes biting wood blended with the distant howl of the wind, creating a muted soundtrack that steadied the hands of all who labored. As night deepened, a shared fire crackled in the center of the courtyard, its warmth slipping into the cracks of the walls, coaxing the frost to retreat inch by inch. By the time the first pale stars peeked through the storm, the granary's roof was patched, the stone walls reinforced, and a quiet pride settled over the community like a soft blanket. When dawn finally brushed the sky with a wan amber, the snow lay in a hushed blanket, and the repaired granary stood solid against the lingering wind. The villagers, their faces smudged with soot and frost, paused to sip thin broth, feeling the heat rise through their chests as a reminder of the night's effort. Myra traced the grain of the timber, noting how the joints now sang a low, steady creak that promised durability. Bram polished the newly forged braces, the metal catching a sliver of morning light, a small testament to improvisation under pressure. Leo watched the children tumble snowballs gently, their laughter a soft echo that seemed to warm the still cold air. In the quiet that followed, the community understood that survival was less about grand designs and more about the patient accumulation of small, attentive actions, a lesson that would linger long after the frost melted. The first light after the gale slipped through the cracked panes, revealing walls that had been hewn with rough stone and packed with layers of earth, now firm against the lingering breath of winter. Villagers emerged from the low-ceilinged hearths, their hands still tinged with the cold of the night, and gathered around a long wooden table where a simple stew simmered in a copper pot. clatter of wooden spoons against bowls mingled with the distant sound of a wind chime swaying in the softened breeze. Children, cheeks flushed from the chill, chased each other around the newly reinforced perimeter, their laughter a low hum against the stone. As the sun slipped lower, the community shared the modest feast, an unsung celebration of collective endurance. Earlier in the week, when the frost had edged deeper into the crofts, the same villagers had struggled to stack firewood while the wind tore at the thatch. Each gust a reminder of their vulnerability. The men and women moved with deliberate slowness, hauling logs from the forest floor, their breath-forming vapor that hung like ghosts over the open fields. The sound of splintering branches echoed as they felled trees, a rhythm that matched the steady tap of rain against stone roofs. Yet the cold seeped through even the thickest wool, forcing shoulders to hunch and faces to turn inward, as if seeking solace in each other's warmth. Through these harsh moments, the urgency of cooperation became a palpable tension, threading through every shared effort. When the chief mason inspected the newly filled walls, he noted with a wry smile that the strongest stones came from the old quarry, a place long abandoned after a legend claimed its depths were cursed, its faces eternally hidden by shadow. The quarry workers, whose tools had long been set aside, were called back, their hands still remembering the weight of granite that no myth could deter. Their laughter, low and weary, rang as they placed each slab, the irony of a forgotten superstition now serving the living. The villagers watched the stone drop into place, feeling the subtle shift of the earth beneath their boots, as if the ground itself exhaled relief. In that quiet exchange, the absurdity of fear turned into a practical lesson. The hidden faces of old tailies giving way to visible foundations. With the walls finally settled, the daily cadence returned to a slower, steadier beat. Mornings were marked by the soft scrape of wooden loaves being pulled from the oven, the scent of yeasty warmth mingling with the faint aroma of pine smoke. Women tended to the herb garden, fingertips brushing the cool soil, while men repaired the thatch, their movements measured, each straw placed with care. The river beyond the village murmured gently, its surface now calm, reflecting the amber glow of lanterns that swayed lazily in the evening air. In these unhurried moments, the community settled into a comfortable stillness. The earlier urgency softened into a shared rhythm of ordinary work. Later, as the hearths dwindled to embers and the night deepened, the elders gathered the younger folk to speak of the season's trial, their voices low and reflective. They spoke of the importance of diversified resources, stone, timber, grain, each a thread woven into the fabric of survival. reminding listeners that reliance on a single source had once left them exposed. The quiet chuckle that rose from a teenager about the cursed quarry highlighted how past anxieties had been transformed into pragmatic knowledge. Eyes, softened by the firelight, traced the contours of the reinforced walls, seeing not just stone, but the collective resolve that had shaped them. In the hush that followed, a gentle gratitude settled over the village, an enduring testament to the quiet strength found when hands work together against the cold.